Grace and peace to you from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. I couldn't help but be drawn to our Job reading this week. In effect, it is the end of the story where Job seemingly gets a happily ever after ending to his life. And that could be problematic for a lot of people. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. This week, after the bishop did an update video about the hurricane efforts down in the Panhandle, we had a bit of a discussion about his mention of the famous scientist Stephen Hawking. The bishop admitted he was displeased at how much attention or press that Stephen Hawking had gotten for one point of his life where he proclaimed that he did not think there was a God. Yet there was something in me that wanted to see a man like Hawking beyond just that moment in his life. Specifically, I don't know a whole lot about physics, actually very little. But I'm pretty sure that Hawking knew a thing or two about black holes, those that are in space and those that he struggled with in his personal life as he dealt with disease. And it may be hard for us to admit this, but there are a lot of people out there who struggle with putting their faith in God for a lot of different reasons. For some, if they had parents who weren't there for them, it's very hard for them to trust that God is going to be there for them. For others, it's a matter of a disappointment and idealism. They embraced the faith with whole heart, soul, and imagination, but somewhere along the way they got hurt. Hypocrisy, inside or outside the church, undermine their ability to have faith. For others, it's the matter of not being able to reconcile the fact that the Bible and our faith are not always consistent. For many, however, the main problem has to do with questioning God's justice. When they go out into the world and try to do something to help people who are suffering, what they see is rampant injustice. And it breaks their heart to the point that they simply cannot believe in the loving God with whom we celebrate this morning, the God of the Bible, the God that we know that our faith tells us about. Because if we really get honest this morning, our world is truly incomprehensible. As one fellow pastor reminded me this week, there were attempted attacks on two former presidents, a former Secretary of State, a former Vice President, 3 members of Congress, along with activists and national security officials. And if that wasn't enough, on Wednesday there was a man in Kentucky who tried to do a repeat shooting of the Emmanuel AME Zion shootings. But he couldn't get into the church, and so he went to a local supermarket where he shot 2 grandparents to death simply because they were black. And if that still isn't enough, yesterday out in Pittsburgh, a man attacked the Tree of Life synagogue and killed 11 worshipers and wounded many others. And if you can believe it, it was just over a year ago that a man tried to gun down an entire Republican congressional baseball team. And at that time, it was the largest political assassination attempt in history until this past week. Yet it probably took you a moment, a second, to remember what I was even talking about just then, the shooting of Steve Scalise. And here's the thing, that troubles me. Because by next year, will we have forgotten the horrors of this week? I struggle with that. And the reason that I'm talking about Job this week is that I think he knew something of that struggle. He lived his whole life based on a faith in God that was defined by a very simple principle, that those who obey God are blessed, and those who disobey God are punished. Therefore, in the logic of this very simplistic faith, those who are blessed with prosperity and success have God's favor, and those who endure hardship and suffering have somehow offended God. That seemed to work for Job for a very long time, because he had amassed great fortune, a wonderful family, loads of friends. But then it seemed that the very ground upon which Job stood gave way. In one fell swoop, he lost everything. In Job's world, there could have been no clearer indication of God's disfavor. And that's precisely what his three friends in the book come to remind him of over and over again. He must have done something to deserve this. And Job maintains, no, I've kept my integrity. And they reply over and over again that he wouldn't be suffering if he hadn't done something to deserve it. Finally, Job exhausts himself with this struggle, and he sort of just gives up. And that's when God appears and asks Job a whole series of questions that seem to kind of put him in his place. We heard some of those last week. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Again and again, God's response to Job's complaints about his suffering are to ask things like, have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Do you give the horse its might? Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars? Of course, as Job realizes, the answer to all of these questions is no. And that brings us to our reading today. Job realized that he had ventured into matters that were somewhat over his head. It's an understatement. In effect, he asked, why am I suffering so when I have always done right? And the answer he receives is, you don't even understand the question. How will you begin to understand the answer? And the answer to Job's question for many of us is there is no answer, at least not one that we can comprehend. Ask anyone who has suffered great loss, great pain, great grief. There's no answer. Job himself comes to admit as much. I have uttered what I did not understand, things too great for me which I do not know. And I think that's part of the answer to our dismay this week, our hurt as well. When we see the injustice and suffering of our world, and we ask how a loving God can allow such things to happen, there is no answer that can sufficiently explain it. There is so much we do not know. And yet there's more to this matter than simply saying, well, I don't understand, so I'm just going to have to surrender or give up. Because one thing that the Bible insists on again and again is that God never forsakes us. No matter what, God asks us always to join in the battle against injustice. Yet I realize that the reality of injustice in this world is so troubling that I don't fault anyone who struggles. And to be honest, I've never cared much for the ending of the book of Job. That is what I referred to earlier. I mean, all of a sudden he just gets everything back, and that's supposed to make it all better? Are the 7 kids and the wife that he gets after this ordeal the same? I don't think so. And if not, that doesn't work for me. Maybe it doesn't work for you. Yet the end of the book of Job does tell something very important. That when the dark night is over, the sun always rises. With God, there is always the promise of hope, of resurrection. And that's all I have to hold on to right now, quite honestly. We don't know when it will come. We don't know how deep the darkness will get. We don't know how long it will hang over us like a pall. We don't know how many valleys of dry bones will appear before us. But God does act, and resurrection is his way. The end of Job is a reminder to anyone sitting in the ashes right now, or to those who will one day sit in the ashes, that as bad as things get, as low as we may feel, one day all shall be well again. But we cannot walk through this earth idly. We must work towards that wellness. We must work towards it right now. As the commentary on the Hebrew Scriptures, the Talmud, reminds us, we are not to be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. We are to do justly now. We are to love mercy now. We are to walk humbly now. We are not obligated to complete the work, nor are we free to abandon it. And the people of God said,